As we all know, we are faced with tremendous amounts of disinformation online, and we rely on journalists and trusted news outlets to report accurate information rooted in facts without bias. Our two panelists today know a lot about that as they investigated Facebook and other social media platforms for, as what our guest Kara Swisher calls so eloquently, amplifying and weaponizing hate. In conversation together, please welcome to the screen Sheera Frenkel, New York Times tech journalist and author of the best-selling book, An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, highlighting insider accounts of the scandals and alleged toxic culture at social media giant Facebook. Alongside Kara Swisher, host of Sway podcast and contributing writer for the New York Times Opinion.
Thank you, Juju. I'm so excited to be here talking to Sheera Frenkel about her book with Cecilia Kang and more. But I first want to, Sheera, you to sort of update us on what's going on at Facebook. There's been so much news, much of it bad out of the company. They've sort of tried to counter with good news, I guess, a rebranding and some information about some changes around their facial recognition. I'd love you to update everybody about what's happening there now.
Right. So Facebook is really trying to change the headlines for themselves. They've rebranded themselves as Meta, though I don't think many people are calling them Meta at this point.
Yeah.
And they announced that they were going to be taking down a pretty controversial facial recognition feature. They tried to position this as something that they're doing sort of out of the goodness of their hearts. But we have to remember that there were lawsuits pending against them in several states. Attorneys generals were worried about this facial recognition feature. And it seems as though if Facebook hadn't taken it down voluntarily, they would have probably faced some kind of legal action over it. And so I think Facebook is still trying to kind of dig itself out of a very bad PR hole that it's currently in, and trying to not just rebrand the name, but rebrand how the public sees them. Now, Kara, you and I have been covering this company for a long time. This is not the first time they've tried to change the conversation. And I think while it's worked somewhat in the past, the last 3-4 years of the company have been difficult. And I don't know that it's going to be right. I don't know that it's going to be easy for them to
so
change.
Let's take that apart. Obviously the most news have been around the Facebook files and the Facebook papers, which have been released, including to you at the New York Times and everywhere else. Let's start with that, because I want to get to Meta and facial recognition last. This is sort of painted a picture. It touched on lots of things, whether it was teen girls or issues of hate speech in other countries, manipulation of the platform in other countries. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is the most important things from those papers and what they portend for the company?
Right. These papers, I mean, what we're really talking about here is 22,000 documents, and reporters, including myself, are still going through them. They are basically the receipts for everything that people have been writing about Facebook for the last 5 years. It is documentation of how the company knew about its problems around hate speech, misinformation, conspiracies, violent content, anti-Semitism. And what's interesting is how many resources the company dedicated to getting to the bottom of that, to uncovering just how bad the problem was on its platform. In a way, it's almost impressive how much Facebook knew about the very real problems that they had. Now, whether or not they did something about it is another story, but they certainly knew how bad the problem was.
And this was researchers they hired on their own, thousands and thousands of researchers to be doing this kind of work internally to give them a sense of what was happening on the platform because of anecdotal criticism, I guess, that didn't have a lot of people had things on the ground and things that were happening in Myanmar and different places and also January 6th. And so, but Facebook wanted to know what was actually happening, was trying to document that, correct?
Right. These are data scientists. They hire them from the best universities in the US. They come from Stanford and Harvard, and they're using, academic standard experiments to try and figure out how bad this is. And what was interesting for me as a reporter is they often cite our work. They'll say, oh, well, there was this article in the New York Times about violence that broke out in Sri Lanka or Myanmar or India. And can we figure out how that happened? Can we figure out how big it is? And I remember there was one really stark moment where they're shown an external paper that's written about how bad political misinformation is on the platform. And they say, oh, well, that's not even the tip of the iceberg. If we actually want to rebuff this, we have to say something about how it's even worse than this one research paper thinks it is, because our metrics are showing that even more people are seeing political misinformation than what this research paper suggests. So they're very honest.
Rebuff it by making it worse, in other words, that showing that it's worse. Okay. All right.
Right. And I actually remember when they came out with a public statement about that particular
Mhm.
paper written by Avaz, and they did say this isn't right, this isn't correct. They just left out the second part about how things were even worse than the Avaz paper had suggested.
Right. And so they did this in order to be self-aware of what was going on so they could counter criticisms, obviously. What from your takeaway with all these different topics, because it does span, as I said, a range of things. What do you think is the most important thing here, not necessarily among topics, but what has happened here? And then we'll get on to how they're trying to fix it, if that is the case at all.
I think that the research is there, and that's important to know because if they hadn't been
Hmm.
doing this research, we would be set back years away from where we currently are. But the
Hmm.
research is there and the suggestions are there. Their own employees gave them, methods. They gave them a path forward to
Hmm.
mitigate some of these really, really bad problems. Now, I don't think anyone at the company, including these researchers, think you're ever going to get rid of 100% of hate speech or 100% of
Right.
misinformation. But they
Right.
certainly drew out, here is what we can do. We can start moderating in our comments. We can
Hmm.
start, looking at things that go hugely viral and put in sort of a step in
Hmm.
between something going hugely viral so that we have the time to check it as a company and make sure it isn't spreading anti-Semitism or hate speech or a conspiracy. The problem with every single measure they suggested is that it stops Facebook's sort of viral growth moments. And
Right.
that's a calculus they're going to have to make as a company, right? Do you want to be a place where things just go hugely viral and you have these bursts of activity and people are drawn to it, whether it's controversial or not? Or do you want to take perhaps what these employees are saying is a more responsible path forward and say things
Right.
are going to slow down? We're going to make an active
to
company
mitigate
decision.
to mitigate the effects of of anything. When you walk out in the world, you have an impact, right? So to mitigate those impacts that they have on great swaths of the population, essentially.
Right, and it's hard for a company whose DNA is move fast and break things, and they may have changed their
Hmm.
motto, but that's still the
Hmm.
Wi-Fi password in their building, it's still what
Right.
employees are told, move fast and break
Hmm.
things, and so it is gonna be hard, and I don't know if they can do it, if they can make that conscious effort to slow themselves down, to
Well,
mitigate what their harms look like.
we'll talk about the attempt at rebranding, but the defense of itself was particularly unusual. One of the things that really struck me, Nick Clegg, who is the whatever his job is, the head of PR, essentially said, "We didn't start hate in this world. We didn't." That was one of their. They had several different ways they went. And one of the things I said is, "No one said you did. Like, but you're just making it worse. I think that, or you're amplifying it, or weaponizing it, or is." I think Renee DeResta recently called it amplaganda, amplified propaganda. Large lot of it quite hateful happening. So how did you make that defense of itself that we didn't start the fire, essentially?
I've heard them take that position before. We all have. And I
Hmm.
think that, yes, it's true. Facebook didn't start hate. Hate is ingrained in mankind and in humankind. And it's been
Hmm.
there for forever. I think that, like the printing press and like every other technological innovation
Hmm.
that's happened, it has been used by bad actors alongside good. And I think the difference here is that Facebook, for a very long time, I'd argue for most of its history, was not thinking about the bad actors. It's not the
Hmm.
way the minds of its founder and its chief executives work. They don't sit in their offices and think, what's the worst use case of this
Right.
product that we're launching?
Right.
And so it's been very hard for them to get ahead of those bad actors and to even imagine or comprehend of all the bad that gets done on
Hmm.
their platform.
Right. And when they do that, I'm struck by why they do it. And because internally right now, it looks as if employees are revolting within the company and saying, this is revolting. This what's happening here is revolting and we want it out there. Where are they right now as a company? And then we'll get into what they're trying to do is run away from their brand a little bit, or move into the future, however you want to put it. But how do you look at what's happening internally at the company? You spent a lot of time writing a book about this. Obviously, one of the things that was interesting about a lot of the releases, and it depends on who the people are, but there's a lot of distaste and disgust at uh, contributing to hate speech, contributing to what happened on January 6th, contributing to anti-vax information. Can you talk about sort of the mood inside the company?
Sure. I mean, as you know, we spoke to over 400 people for our book, and the vast majority of them
Hmm.
still work at Facebook. And they're so disappointed. They're so angry at the company because these are things that they've been kind of screaming from the rooftops for years now, and they haven't been ignored. And now this research is out there for everyone to see. And they're asking their managers, they're asking their executives, finally, now, are you going to take it seriously? Are you going to change? And so far, all they've heard about is like a name change and a pivot to the metaverse. Like, to the people who work there, that doesn't feel real and substantial. And like their real questions there are going to be addressed. I actually think that the employee revolt, as you called it, that's the existential threat to Facebook. Not any article that I write, not a best-selling book. That's not going to be the thing that really ultimately affects Facebook. But if their own employees start to walk away, which we're already seeing happen, and if they struggle to recruit new employees, which by all accounts is also happening, their recruiters are really having a hard time getting, new young grads from Stanford and MIT to want to join a company that's mired in so many problems. That is going to be a long-term existential threat to Facebook's ability to succeed.
Right. So the name change, that's a way to do it. Well, you're not working for Facebook, you're working for Meta. Talk a little bit about this, because they, of course, Mark went out of his way in his few interviews he gave to largely friendly people to talk about that. No, it has nothing to do with one. And they have probably been working on it for a while, this idea. Talk about why they're doing this, and then the dangers in these. They're saying they're going to do it safer this time. But the idea of a metaverse feels like it could be a really great place for hateful people to gather together if it wasn't well managed, which is one of the issues around Facebook.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, yes, as you said, Mark Zuckerberg has been working on this name change for a while, but I don't think any of us are naive that it got rolled out in the midst of all these controversies in the middle of congressional inquiry. That's not an accident either. Switching and pivoting to the metaverse was something that Mark Zuckerberg it's so built into who he is as a person. He always wants to be focused on the new. Let's move on. What's the hot new product I can launch? What's he still thinks of himself as the 21-year-old.
I'm going to leave this dumpster fire back here while I move to the next thing that I caused, but I'm going to go this way.
Right. And as you said, like, what is a metaverse? It's just an online world that they're asking everyone to join. And if that hate speech and that conspiracy and that, anti-vax content or whatever is now coming at you in a 3D world, but rather than the 2D screen that you're looking at every day, I imagine it is much more impactful. And I imagine it is a real vector for bad actors out there who want to try and reach people. And so whatever answers we come to as a society, and I do think there's a really significant role here for government regulators, for lawmakers all over the world, whatever answers they come to have to be applied before the metaverse is something that, we're actually downloading and using in our lives. Because this is going to require sensors and microphones all over your house. It's going to require a lot of privacy invasive technology, right? In order to get you physically into this online world. And if we don't have safeguards in place, I can't see how people would want to go forward with this.
Do you think, given their history, Facebook is concerned about this? I mean, they've talked about it. This time will be different. This time it's sort of like the bad boyfriend excuse or something, like, now I have changed in this way. Do you feel that they're hearing a lot of this? Because what I saw in that demo and what I saw with a lot of the statements was the same kind of forget about the past arrogance and we're moving on. And don't you like the future, Kara? Like, what are you, a bummer? That kind of thing they've done over and over and over again, this company, without any kind of interest in consequence and the impact that they've had.
Well, I think actions speak louder than words. The only mention of safety or privacy came almost 45 minutes into their presentation on the metaverse. They talked about how the games are going to be fun and how you can have virtual meetings before they talked to, or even, and this is, by the way, just lip service, right? We didn't hear what their actual safety and privacy plan was. We just heard that they want to work on safety and privacy. So it didn't feel as though that was a really big priority for them. No. And look, they haven't changed who runs the company. They haven't changed who advises the person who runs the company. I think that if they had hired someone very senior who could be a real check on Mark Zuckerberg's power and said, this is a person whose top priority is making sure this is a safe place, making sure privacy is guarded, making sure we think about bad actors. And you know what? We're going to build into the structure of this company that Mark Zuckerberg has to hear him out. He has to take him seriously. Maybe there's even a vote. That would speak a lot louder than anything else Facebook is currently doing.
That, from I can tell, is not happening with the latest thing. We only have just another minute. Talk about, I hate to focus in on the dangers, but I tend to do that when I see products. Like, what's the very word? What is the Black Mirror episode of this particular product? So could you, in just a minute that we have left, talk about what could happen in this metaverse? Obviously, we saw you can play cards, you can change your outfits, you can float around. And you saw one from Microsoft where people without legs were floating around, talking to each other in a workplace. There's all these sort of happy, shiny ways to do it. And there are a lot of things that will be assets in order to give us an idea of what could happen in a bad version of the metaverse, or what could happen here.
So imagine everything bad that happens on Facebook, and it's now happening in that 3D world. So Facebook likes to show a version of itself, which is mom groups and people trading cute photos of their puppies, and business owners, expanding their businesses. And that's fine. That happens on Facebook. But now imagine a virtual world in which people in India and Pakistan are trading conspiracies over an attack that happened along their border. And imagine that in that virtual world, they have video, which is heavily, altered. It's maybe even a deep fake, which is incredibly convincing because you're immersed in it, which is telling you that your side of that conflict is right, and that the other side is out to get you. And that if you don't physically defend your home, and if you don't even go out and attack that other person, that harm will come to you. You can just imagine how convincing that'll be. And you can imagine how convincing it'll be for people who want to spread any kind of speech or anti-Semitism when they can present it in that immersive experience of, here are the Jews that are trying to run the world. Here are the Muslims that are coming for your home, et cetera, et cetera. That's why I said it was so important for people to get ahead of this before the metaverse is introduced.
Absolutely. Well, Sheera, thank you so much. I can see a lot of things that could be good here, but you could immediately begin to understand why it could be quite dangerous in the wrong hands. And by the way, it's not, just to be clear, Sheera, this is not going to just be created by Facebook. It's throughout technology. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, meaning there'll be very good players and then there'll be players. And just because Mark says it's so doesn't mean they're going to own this metaverse, although that's now what their company's called. Anyway, Sheera, thank you so much. And thank you for letting us speak here.
Thank you so much for having us.